Welcome to Coffee with Gaz, special edition titled Books with Gaz. The coffee is still present. So, as you will know from watching these Coffee with Gaz videos, my intention all along has been to discuss topics that have been requested by people. And one of the topics that has come up multiple different times is book recommendations, any book recommendations, and this is something that kind of comes up in direct messages on Instagram and Facebook all the time. Really, is what book should I read? Even my clients, what book should I read? Any book recommendations? I know you read a lot of books. Do you have any recommendations? And people aren't just interested in the health and fitness type stuff. So basically, what I'm going to do is maybe every third or fourth week, I'll do a special edition of the Coffee with Gaz where we call it Books with Gaz, and I'll basically take you through one of the books that I have read that I recommend that others read. I'll give you, some excerpts from the book, read out a couple of passages that may be of interest, and try to give you my take home from the book. And then we'll basically, pop a link down below if you want to go and buy the book. It's a Triage affiliate link for Book Depository, so if you do want to buy the book and also support us along the way, then that would absolutely be fantastic. But the first book that I'm going to discuss is Ordinary Men by Christopher Browning, and this is an absolutely fantastic book and one that I would recommend that everyone reads. And the reason I wanted to discuss this in this video and on a fitness channel is because if you followed me and Patty for any length of time, you'll know that our kind of overall theme in general, that the things that we're actually interested in is how to be a good person, how to live a good life, how to kind of do something worthwhile in the world. And one of the traps that people can often fall into is the assumption that they are an inherently good person and that other people are evil. And this is a kind of a good and evil problem that comes up a lot of the time in religious discussions. And depending on your political affiliation, you might think that my people are good whereas others are bad. It could be a thing that occurs on a national level. You could think that, all right, everyone from my country is good, from another country is bad. That basically the idea that some of us think that we are inherently good, and that someone like me or people like me cannot do harm in the world, that you would not have been one of the people to do harm in the concentration camps, that we all like to think that we would have been the ones that would have stood up and said that's actually not happening on my watch. I'm actually going to stop this. I'm not going to be responsible for killing the Jews. I'm not going to be responsible for that. And that's obviously a big emphasis in this book in particular. So basically what this book is it's about the Reserve Police Battalion 101 and the final solution in Poland. So the final solution, obviously, with reference to the Holocaust in Nazi Germany and Poland and surrounding areas. So basically, the author of the book, Christopher Browning, basically what he's trying to demonstrate in this book is the kind of cycle that the guards, this reserve police battalion, that they went through from being regular everyday people to basically becoming mass murderers who had the capacity to kind of shoot children and rationalize it to themselves. And the reason that I think that is such a potent message and something that is worth reading about is because I like to think that when I'm reading books like this, this is a message that I've taken from Jordan Peterson and Jocko Willink, both of whom discuss this book as well. Taking that message that, I could have been that person, reading it through the lens of the individual who's actually doing the harm. Because what often happens when we watch movies or read books where evil is involved, or we hear stories of the evil that has been done in the world, we, again, as I said, we attribute certain characteristics to those people and assume that they're inherently evil, whereas we're inherently good, and that we wouldn't have been like those individuals. Whereas when you read books like this, and many other books throughout history, if you read the Gulag Archipelago, you get a very similar feel for what went on. If you read other books about the Nazi concentration camps, you get a similar feel for what went on. You get this feeling that, you know, these were, or in a lot of cases, you're getting regular people that are dragged along. Their behavior kind of creeps to the point where they're now mass murderers, but it's kind of the norm among the individuals that they're going to work with every day. You know, so we all have norms that we kind of live by, and very often we haven't arrived at those norms, you know, in our job or whatever, as a result of us, you know, deciding that this is the best way to do things. That's often not the case. Sometimes we do things just as a result of path dependence. So this is the way something has always been done, so I'm going to keep doing it like that. So if you have this basically situation where your circumstances and the norms and the kind of you know, the general belief structure of the people around you, and hence the attitudes and beliefs towards others and the acceptable behaviors towards others, if they begin to creep in a certain direction, you basically start to see that as normal, or at least you can begin to normalize. Not to say that you don't look at that and think something is wrong, or that there's not some sort of sickening feeling that's going on, because that does really appear in the book. So I'm going to read out a couple of passages to give you a feel for what's going on in the book. So speaking early on in the book, the author brings up the story of one of the majors who is basically relaying on orders from up the chain. So basically what you've got is this leadership hierarchy. So you've got the commands coming down the chain, and then they arrive at Major Wilhelm Trapp. And some of the names and stuff are changed in this, but you know, it's not too, you don't have to worry about that for now. But anyway, the author writes, pale and nervous, with choking voice and tears in his eyes, Trapp visibly fought to control himself as he spoke. The battalion, he said plaintively, had to perform a frightfully unpleasant task. This assignment was not to his liking. Indeed, it was highly regrettable, but the orders came from the highest authorities. And that's important, because but the orders came from the highest authorities. And basically what that is insinuating is that in this context where they're being ordered to basically start to round people up and start to kill them, essentially, like that's where we're going with this. My interpretation of that would be that when you start to get into a situation in which you don't necessarily take that extreme ownership, to use kind of Jocko Willink's language, you don't take that extreme ownership for your own role in the chain of command, basically what ends up happening is that you can just kind of offload that ownership up the chain. So if you're in a position in a hierarchy in a business or something, and you're in a position where you don't necessarily feel like you have the authority, so you're kind of just saying, oh well, my boss said it, so I'm just going to do it even if you think it's wrong, you're basically allowing for things to get out of order and to become chaotic. So the courageous individual, and we all like to think that we would be this person if we were in such a situation, but it's unlikely to be the case a lot of the time. The courageous individual is the one who stands up and says, you know, sorry boss, I'm actually just, you know, I'm struggling to get on board with these orders. Could you clarify exactly, you know, why we're doing this, just so I understand the purpose of the mission, you know, something along those lines. When you start to ask those questions, and you start to really make sure that you know exactly why you're doing what you're doing and whether or not that aligns with your values, you're the one that can then be that kind of stopping point between, you know, orders just flowing from the top to the bottom, and the unfortunate chaos that then unravels from that. So obviously it's not to say that, you know, one individual could have stopped the whole Holocaust from taking place, but it is to say that, you know, these situations do pop up in everyday life, and you have to be willing to stand up and say, you know, actually I'm not having that, that's not actually happening on my watch. Because if you don't have the courage to do that, that's how these things continue to unfold, because you've got many individuals who are complicit, despite the fact that they don't necessarily believe that these actions are appropriate. So all you need then is an intolerant minority. If you have an intolerant minority who are willing to push these things to the extreme, and everyone else isn't willing to stand up and basically stop it, even though there might be a majority of them, then you're basically going to get tyranny unfolding. So courage, lads, courage. So this is just a brief line that says, in a subsequent action in Mogilev in early October, the need to explain the shooting of Jewish women was no longer felt. And I made a quick note about that there, just you know, normalization in asterisks. And the important thing about that is that this is basically a sequence of events where previously there had to be a specific justification for these types of actions, whereas now it's just not even justified. It's like, well, this is what we do now. So basically what you've got is this creep. So it never feels like you're going from zero, good person, normal police activities to extreme chaos and murder of children. But as you basically take those tiny steps, you assist in the killing of one person, you kill one person, you kill 2 people, you kill 10 people, you kill women and children, now you're shooting children, these types of things. That's how it begins to creep, and that normalization begins to take place. And that's not to say that all the officers were okay with that, because a lot of the times in this book you do get people who are feeling absolutely sick to their stomach, they're unable to do it, and they're coming up with rationalizations that seem insane. But yeah, that's why you should read the book. So another quick passage. 25% of the deported Jews dying on the train from suffocation, heat prostration and exhaustion, to say nothing about those killed in the shooting, which was so constant that the guards extended their entire ammunition supply as well as replenishment. The casual mentioned that even before the deportations, hundreds of Jews judged too old, frail or sick to get to the train were routinely shot in each action. So pretty simple there. You get the feeling this is an absolutely horrible situation that none of us would like to be in. So again, you have to have the courage, you have to stand up, you have to try and stop, you have to try and stick to your values, no matter how hard it might be. So this is a part that I really want you to pay attention to. So in this segment of the book, what the author is describing is basically the class background, the types of individuals that form this police battalion who were able to basically mass murder women and children. These are the types of people. They are ordinary men. That's the point of the book. About 63% were of working class background, but few were skilled labourers. The majority of them held typical Hamburg working class jobs: dock workers, truck drivers, also many warehouse and construction workers, machine operators, seamen, waiters. 35% were lower middle class, virtually all of them white collar workers. This is the important bit. By virtue of their age, of course, all went through their formative period in the pre-Nazi period. So these were men who had known political standards and moral norms other than those of the Nazis. Most came from Hamburg, by reputation one of the least Nazified cities in Germany, and the majority came from a social class that had been anti-Nazi in its political culture. So again, we're not however true that might be, I think there is some debate. I've read some back and forth about this author's take versus other authors' takes, and I'm not an expert on German culture in the 1930s, 1940s, but point here being that these are not, your typical radical Nazis. These were not your typical fans of Hitler. These were people who were more likely to not be part of that ideology, but they were still able to commit these heinous crimes. So just important to keep that in mind. So back to major trap again, and this is really important because one of the things that you start to pick up is that you've got people who are in charge, who are delegating these orders, who do not believe that they are righteous things to commit. They do not believe that what they are doing is, they're not ideologically possessed. They're not saying, oh, we must kill all these Jews because they're disgusting, because they're horrible. Rather, the sickening thing about it, you'd almost say that if that was the case, that they genuinely believed that and they were following it up, that it would be less of a scary situation for us, because for us as individuals who think we're good people, it's almost scarier to think that these people kind of disagreed with what they were doing, but they were still able to do it. That's terrifying, because you start to see the evil in yourself, and that's important. That's the message I would take away from this book. And Major Trap basically says here that, oh God, why did I have to be given these orders? As he put his hand on his heart. And then next, man, such jobs don't suit me, but orders are orders. Another man remembered vividly how Trap, finally alone in our room, sat in a stool and wept bitterly. The tears really flowed. So this is a man who knows he's about to give orders to, again, continue these heinous crimes of murdering groups, tens, hundreds of Jews, of women, children, shooting them in the back of the head, piling bodies up, putting them into holes in the ground. He knows what he's about to do. He doesn't necessarily agree with it. He's weeping. He feels the pain in himself. He doesn't want to do it, but he does, and he gives the order, and things continue to go forward. So again, lose this notion of inherent evil, that some people just, that these people are just, oh, they're just evil, they're different to me, that couldn't have been me. that could have been you. You know, would you have been the major in the police who would have stood up to the whole hierarchy of the Nazis and said, I'm actually not allowing this to take place anymore. This actually isn't something that's going to happen on my watch, you know? I think it's hard to say that you would have been that person. It's hard. Maybe you would have been. Camera died there. Where was I? Right. So, this is something that is a particularly good segment here as well. So, before the policemen climbed into their trucks and left Josewov, Polish friends, help me out. I'm going to go with Josewov. A 10-year-old girl appeared, bleeding from the head. She was brought to Trapp, who took her in his arms and said, "You shall remain alive." Okay, so that's again Major Trapp, who had been, you know, feeling quite shitty about himself, but what he was doing. What you see there is that there's some humanity remaining, you know, that we're not just looking at an individual who is totally evil with no empathy for any other individual, that there's still some capacity there. And again, these things can sound on the surface like you're standing up for the individual, that you're standing up for this behavior. That's not the case at all. Rather, it's actually a reminder to yourself, and you have to keep reminding yourself of that here. That's the scary thing. It's far scarier to think that these were normal people than to think that they're just evil people. And then the next bit again, really important. Major Trapp made the rounds trying to console and reassure them. So he's talking about his officers here, you know, because they were depressed, angered, embittered, and shaken. They ate little but drank heavily. So these are officers, young officers, who are coming in again with their ordinary backgrounds. They're coming in after murdering tens, hundreds of Jews at this point. You know, the murders are beginning to increase in frequency, increase in volume, and they're feeling the repercussions of that. You know, they're not happy about it. They're not going home celebrating it. And Major Trapp, again, is placing the responsibility on higher authorities. So what you've got here is a battalion of men all creating heinous crimes. Their leader feels shitty about it too. You know, he's not happy about it. One of the other leaders does have more of that sadism. You know, he's more of a vicious individual, more encompassed with that ideology. But what you've got here is the majority that don't really seem to be. And again, we're handing that ownership up the chain of command. We're saying that it's someone else's responsibility. You're coming down off your own actions, and you're saying that, well, I know what I did was awful, but it was actually at the orders of someone else. So again, you have to take ownership for everything in your world. Everything. This is the bit that hit me hardest when reading the book, because basically what the officers are getting at in this segment here is their justifications or rationalizations, their coping mechanisms. You know, many of us have to think about how we cope with, different things in our lives, whether it be, you know, hunger or something like that. Here, what we're talking about is the ability to cope with committing awful, hideous crimes, murdering women and children. The ability to cope with that, you know. It's a different monster. And one of the lines says, "I thought that I could master the situation, and that without me, the Jews were not going to escape their fate anyway." So, kind of handing it off, you know, saying that, well, I'm part of this anyway. This is kind of the norm. This is going to happen. If I stop and try to tell those up the chain of the command that I'm not doing this, it doesn't matter, because, you know, it's just going to happen anyway. So again, it comes back to the power of the individual and taking responsibility for everything in your world. Because if you don't, and every single person in that node, every single node in the network is thinking, what I do doesn't matter, then you get this descent into tyranny, because you don't have the courageous individual standing up. And this is definitely the roughest part of the whole book, and one of the last things that I will read. And this is one young man's justification for why he only killed children. Now, what kind of mindset do you have to be in? And here we go, really. He says, "I made the effort, and it was possible for me to shoot only children. It so happened that the mothers led the children by the hand. My neighbour then shot the mother, and I shot the child that belonged to her, because I reasoned with myself that after all, without its mother, the child could not live any longer. It was supposed to be, so to speak, soothing to my conscience to release children unable to live without their mothers." Now, that's rough. But in particular, one of the words chosen there, release children. Okay, this is obviously translated into English, but really what we're looking at there is a German phrase, an Erlöser. Okay, so Erlöser. My German accent is rustly. So basically, the phrase to be an Erlöser is to be someone who is a savior or a redeemer. You know, so that's the German word for release, is Erlösen, and to be that person is to be someone in a religious sense who is a savior, who is the redeemer. You know, so trying to basically pull back that sense of I am doing something that is, you know, in some way good. So I'm trying to justify this. I'm trying to say that by shooting only children, I'm actually doing something that is reducing the amount of suffering in the world, because that individual would otherwise suffer, and that's dangerous. You know, that's you don't really need to say much about it really, other than again coming back to that point that, you know, this could be you. So you watching this, that could be you. You know, and don't be foolish enough to think otherwise. And something I made note of here was the minority rule, which is something that's discussed extensively by Nassim Taleb in his books. So the inserto, we'll discuss those in another video. But so Nada's gratuitous and horrific sadism at the grave's edge was only one instance of how he chose to exercise leadership in this regard, but such examples soon multiplied. So again, this guy Nada, he's one of the individuals who is, you know, he's on board with the ideology. He's the one, the major kind of perpetrator here, who's kind of pushing everyone else on and really pushing the boundaries of what evil is. And the final sentence of that passage closes with such leadership and the help of the Travnikis at Lomazzi, the men of Second Company took a major step toward becoming hardened killers. And I made note of that, saying the minority rule. Basically what is happening there is that we've got this guy Nada, who is the extreme individual. He's the intolerant one. He's the one willing to push the boundaries, and nobody else is willing to stand up and say that this is not what I'm going to do, you know. So you've got a group of individuals who may not necessarily be on board with what they're doing, but because it is being normalized and because there are orders coming from up the chain of command, these things continue to take place, and graves are filling, and Jews are dying, children are dying, women are dying, and it's just an all-round pretty fucking awful situation at this point. So two final segments that I'm going to read out that again I think are really important, and you'll get the message from them. So growing callousness can also be seen in the post-shooting behaviour of the policemen. After Josepov and the early shootings, the men had returned to their quarters shaken and embittered, without appetite or desire to talk about what they had just done. With the relentless killings, such sensitivities were dulled. One policeman recalled, at the lunch table some of the comrades made jokes about the experience they'd had during an action. From their stories I could gather that they had just finished a shooting action. I remember as especially crass that one of the men said, "Now we eat the brains of slaughtered Jews." Only the witness found this joke less than hilarious. So again, what you're seeing here is normalization, desensitization, that these things were once horrible, once things that sickened them, and now we're starting to see some laughing. Then another passage here that's important. I must emphasize that from the first days I left no doubt among my comrades that I disapproved of these measures and never volunteered for them. Thus, on one of the first searches for the Jews, one of my comrades clubbed a Jewish woman in my presence and I hit him in the face. A report was made, and in that way my attitude became known to my superiors. I was never officially punished, but anyone who knows how the system works knows that outside official punishment there is the possibility for chicanery that more than makes up for punishment. Thus, I was assigned Sunday duties and special watches. So what you've got there is someone who did have the courage to stand up amidst chaos and say, hey, this isn't for me. But as you can see, there are repercussions to that. And you can imagine that the repercussions would have gone far beyond just those Sunday duties and special watches. You know, you can imagine that individual being shunned by his comrades, you know, within the battalion if everyone else is doing one thing and you're not willing to do it. There's also the case that you're not willing, or there's also the point that could be made by them that they're not willing to carry the load. So if everyone finds it horrible, but you're leaving the horrible jobs just to certain individuals and not doing them yourself, then you're worsening what they have to do. So you can see how these kind of group dynamics begin to create a situation in which it's easier to go along with what is happening than to actually stop it. So you have to be the courageous, intolerant individual who's saying, no, I'm not doing this. Because if you're not, you're going to be the murderer. And again, you watching this, you would have been the individual that killed the Jews, you know. You could have done it. And you could do it again. And it doesn't matter. Jewish individuals, black individuals, white individuals, doesn't matter. You know, anyone, someone you don't like. In certain circumstances, or given the correct circumstances, a certain social context, you could be that evil individual. And yeah, it goes on, it goes on, it goes on, it goes on. And look, there's so much in this book that, like, you look how many little tabs I've got there. There's so much in there that is that's worth reading, and there's so many points where I found myself just shivering while reading it and feeling like, Jesus Christ, this is awful. But the temptation, guys, all the time when you read horrible books like that is to say, oh my God, those people are so evil, you know. And obviously there are personality traits, there are defects, there are problems, you know, in particular individuals. You know, we're not all the exact same, and of course some people do have a tendency towards, you know, evil and psychopathy more than others. But the really important thing there throughout that book and throughout many other stories throughout history is that you, as a regular everyday person, you might love your family, you might have respect for your fellow man, but in a certain circumstance, you know, where things begin to normalize and behavior begins to creep, you can do things that you could never have imagined yourself doing. And at a particularly politically volatile time that we're in, I think it's really, really important to remember that what you do not want to fall victim to is, not victim to, the trap you don't want to fall into is the trap of believing that other people are bad and that you are good. You must have empathy. You must try to appreciate, where is this individual coming from? You know, it can be hard at times. We like to ridicule others, you know, and sometimes ridicule can turn to hate, to distaste, to dehumanization. And that's really where things start to become dangerous, is where you start to dehumanize another individual and say that they are in some way not the same type of human as you, and everyone should be like you. And when you start to develop that level of intolerance, that's when evil things can become manifest. That's when things can begin to creep out of control. So there might be particular groups, particular ideologies that you do not agree with, that make you feel sick to your stomach, you know, but you have to try to do your best to engage in dialogue, to have productive conversations, to try to steel man another person's point of view before you challenge it, you know, to try to have those productive conversations, you know, to make good points, to think things through, to not fall victim to ideology, even when there's an incentive structure in place that would make you